Greetings to our friends and colleagues around the world. My name is Jan Hurwitz, and we welcome you to our fourth in the series of Rethinking the Future, sponsored by the Visionary Ethics Foundation, the Tropical Agricultural Research and Higher Education Center, CATIE, and FIDER, the Foundation for Research in Rural Development. In this fourth webinar, we are taking a look at education with vision in times of crisis. The need to rethink education is clearly evident, as Mother Nature is clearly telling her 7 billion tenants to change our behavior or we will be evicted. And now, to formally open our webinar, I am pleased to present the Director General of CATIE, Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim.
Good morning, good afternoon, where you're from. Thanks to Ms. Jan Hurwitz for organizing this important webinar, Rethinking the Future Education with Vision. And also let me take the opportunity to acknowledge her leadership role in advancing the discussion of such an important theme in the midst of a pandemic, which is affecting the world, and therefore we need to look at a new future, rethinking the future for education with vision. We are pleased at CATIE to be supporting this exploration of the future as we rethink education with all of institutions organizing this important event. This involves so many different dimensions and perspectives as we struggle to go beyond the dialogue of in-person versus virtual learning, which is of course important, but we must go further. Today, as we continue our webinar series on rethinking the future, education with vision, we admit to a worldwide crisis in education with a long history. As you can see in the CNN news, there are many discussions of what form of education the young and the different age groups should be taking and how to address the health issue. This has resulted in, as Edgar Morin of UNESCO says, a fragmented thinking which mostly fails to consider the important connections which make our world so complex. Therefore, a metamorphosis is required to transform our humanity into individuals with solidarity, vision, and a new way of living, more sustainably, along with the capacity to think and act systematically. What are some of the most important human qualities required to navigate this uncertain 21st century? According to Yuval Noah Harari, mental balance and emotional intelligence are prominent on the list. This should be complemented by developing a capacity to change, to adapt with flexibility, to keep learning throughout life, and to commit to lifelong education. Education and learning is an ongoing process, and we never stop learning in our life cycle. Resilience in life requires these qualities, as well as mental strength and a capacity to deal with failure. We often say that we learn more from projects that fail than we learn from successful projects. The same is often true in life. Another area which we must be strengthened in is ethics. Where there is ethics, there is trust. And where there is trust, we work toward common goals more easily and with greater commitment and persistence. A more ethical stance built upon trusting the environment we share together should be led to realizing new scenarios of hope for the future. Paulo Freire, who would have been 100 this year, learned a great deal from Brazilian and Chilean farmers and their communities. From his interaction with them, he developed his pedagogy of hope, which involves the adventure of unveiling the truth, understanding inequality, and pushing for reform, particularly in the agriculture and agroecological sector. The recent IPCC report issued by the UN in just 6 days ago remind us of the important connection between education and climate change. For it is education which forms the policymakers of the future. It is education which molds the advisors to these very policymakers. And yet, at the more holistic level, it is education that is responsible for creating an enlightened citizenry which demands that policymakers be responsive to Mother Earth and all whom she supports. And education is also important for building awareness in terms of our habits, our lifestyles, consumer patterns, which is important to reducing the impacts of climate change and safeguarding the planet and its health. In closing, I wish to thank our 3 guest speakers. Dr. Stanley Brun of the University of Kentucky in the United States, Dr. Concepcion Olavarrieta of Mexico, and Dr. Jerome Glen of the US, both with the Millennium Project. I'm sure that with these experienced panelists will provide us with good information as to how we can rebuild and rethink the future for education with a vision. Thank you so much, and thanks to Jan once again, and I hope that this webinar will be very successful.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. And thank you and the entire CATIA team for your support for these webinars on Rethinking the Future. A vision with foresight, the long view, going beyond the horizon, navigate uncertain times, a future composed of multiple crises. It is not for the timid, but for the thinking dreamers. We often say that in times of crisis, these are times for change. Today, our second webinar on Rethinking Education focuses on COVID lessons for the future of education. There is no doubt that with very few exceptions, Education at all levels is falling short of our requirements and has failed us and is failing our children. Today's panelists have each had an extraordinary dedication to education for the future, and their thinking should help to free us all from the academic straitjacket which we humans have created. Today, we will continue to look at education through multiple lenses, particularly as a complex discipline which must be examined holistically. Dr. Stanley Brunn of the University of Kentucky will start with an update on his global survey of the impact of COVID-19 on multiple sectors and the implications for teaching and learning. Dr. Jerry Glen of the Millennium Project will share the lessons learned from the preparation of the COVID scenarios for the American Red Cross. And Dr. Concepcion Olavarrieta will take us to Mexico for the Mexico 2050 experience. We are grateful to our panelists and to the participants, who we hope will share their questions in the chat as we move toward a more fluid understanding of what living in harmony in the future will entail. And now to present our first panelist. Dr. Stanley Brunn is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Geography at the University of Kentucky. His interests include human-environment intersections in studying contemporary society, culture, politics, languages, and religions. He has traveled to more than 100 countries and has taught in more than 20 around the world on all continents. For decades, he has taught and done research on the geographies of creativity, imaginary cartographies, and alternative geography futures. One of his present projects is editing a mega volume on the ad hoc geographies associated with COVID-19 worlds, where there are many more unanswered questions than answered questions about what is going on, where, and why. Welcome, Stan.
Next, please. Thank you, Jan, for the introduction. Thank you for participating, asking us to participate in this webinar. It's an honor, and I want to learn something from everybody who contributes today to help us learn more about the future. I'm going to share some ideas about the future based on teaching classes in the past on future worlds, doing research on the subject, and also currently working on a mega volume about COVID. I can share more about that later. Let me begin by making 3 points. Thinking about the future, in the past, many people have probably thought of this as a luxury. Very few people did it. They had time to think about it. Now I think about the future is more a necessity than it is a luxury. We need to do it. Second point, we're going to focus on education. Education cuts across many different fields, many different disciplines. The same discussion we could have talking about religion, faith communities, talking about politics, talking about the corporate world, talking about healthcare and welfare. All of these are intersecting fields of study. All of them today need to look at the future. The third point is that thinking in the past, I think the world can really be constructed as one looking at silos, vertical structures, where the world was full of vertical structures, full of silos. That's kind of isolated thinking today. We need to work more about the horizontal than we do about the vertical. We need to think about common grounds between the different silos. I can think of universities, I can think of governments, I can think of corporations that operate in a silo mentality. Why? In part because that's the way they were structured, that's the way that they thought they existed, and they thought they served their populations the best that way. But that's kind of... So in this first slide, just want to share a few ideas and move on to the second one. So there are new worlds, plural, new worlds being created right before our eyes. If you don't believe me, look around you, talk with people, see what your institutions are doing, see what your governments are doing. Things are being not only restructured, but reconstructed right before us. We talk about Renaissance. Renaissance period in history is mainly seen from the discipline of history. That's unfortunate because Renaissance also is space. It's also place. We can think about this concept about liquid time. Liquid time, times that are fusing, times that are coming together. But spaces are also liquid, aren't they? I'm looking out my window at home, and I have about 6 neighbors across the street. I never communicate with them. Never. Once in a while, I'll say hi to them, but some I do not even know. I communicate with people around the world every day, all continents. So it's liquid time and liquid space. Both of them are fluid. Both of them are dynamic as opposed to static and stable. So that's the kind of world we live in. The next to the last point is about learning. Think what you have learned. Much of what you have learned and I have learned, we're going to have to unlearn, going to have to relearn. We've so much talked about learning in silos, learning in compartments, instead of looking at what those compartments have in common. So we're going to talk about new norms. There's not going to be a new norm. There never was a norm. But now we're waking up to new norms. And then this last phrase, ad hoc worlds. These are worlds which are being created, just like that. Maybe a bit slower, some places very fast, some places very slow. But those ad hoc worlds are personal, community, country, and the world. Next slide. Education. In this book I'm editing on COVID with authors around the world, the single most important finding is that the problems that teachers face, administrators face in education are the same everywhere. They're not different in China from South Africa. They're not different in Australia than they are from Singapore. They're not different from Brazil from what they are in Kazakhstan. All are having to try to grope with this new world that's out there. Second point, we've mostly looked at innovations in the past in terms of technology, whether it be the typewriter, whether it be the telephone, whether it be the computer, whether it be Skype, whether it be apps, all those are technology. These are times in which we're talking about different kinds of innovation, human innovations, human contacts, human networks. Time. This is a very important time when people are taking a look at what they're doing, what they're teaching, how they're teaching it, and what do they expect. And you can bet that in 20 years, That generation is going to look back on 2020, 2021 and say, some countries had it all together. Some institutions had it all together. Some did not. Some tried to repeat the past, recycled the past, but that's not working. The next point, do we teach facts? Facts, or do we teach frameworks? There's a big difference. What do we want of our students today? Factual knowledge or framework knowledge, conceptual things, how things fit together? I can think of political science friends. Now some study climate change. They never did before. I have people in religion studying environment. They never did before. So we're talking about new worlds that are out there. The boundaries between disciplines are becoming increasingly blurred. I'll say this again in a few minutes, increasingly blurred. So what is a political scientist? What is a geographer? What is an economist? What is an engineer? And think about that blurringness that exists out there. You blur or you think in a silo. So the last point is this. Let's think about creativity. Let's mix arts and sciences. In the book I'm editing, I have people writing about music, art, and COVID. You may think that COVID only is a health problem. No way. It's a global problem with all disciplines affected. Every discipline, every social science, every natural science, all the humanities. They're kind of rethink and think what they've been doing. Next one. So content and structure. You learn by doing and by relearning. We're going to have to find some ways to reinvent what we've been doing. Think about this, face-to-face, which we had in the past, which we thought was best, which we thought was normal, which we thought was acceptable, but now it's some combination. We still have to figure out how those face-to-face, the teaching in a class, fit together and make a better knowledge. We need to think about that. Some combination seems to be what's going to be in the future. And that can be from primary grades through disciplines getting for postgraduate work. Learning from home, in the classroom, or in the classroom. I have authors in this book writing about the problems that parents face in African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries, the same as they are in the United States and Canada or someplace else. It's just a whole different world that's out there. We're having to figure out learning in different kinds of ways. Think about the next term, race, gender, and class. All of these are new fields of study in the past 20 years. All of them are being affected by COVID. All of them are being affected by COVID in one way or another. Governments, families, institutions, learning. So we're going to have to relearn something about race and gender and class. Again, it's a fluid world. The next point, do we teach individuals or do we teach collective? We have often prized in education, prized the individual doing something. What can she do? What can he do? I think we're going to have to figure out ways that we can work together collectively. Work together on a group project, not be a solo person only doing something. When you have three minds working on a common issue, it's better than having one. So we have to learn something about this symbiosis, something about this collectivity, this networking that comes from working together. And that is alien, not liked, and even despised by some teachers and educators because they want individuality. The final point here, assignments, and projects and evaluation. This is constantly a problem I see with respect to teachers writing about this past year. What kind of assignments do they give? How do they evaluate them? What can they learn from them? And in many ways, they're just kind of part of this ad hoc world. It's a different world out there than what they were trained to do. But they have to figure out something, creativity, with individual and group projects so they can learn in a different way. The next point. I made this point already. Do we teach disciplines or do we teach interdisciplines? Interdisciplinary is a muesli, a mix. It's like your breakfast food. It's nuts and fruits and grains and all kinds of peanuts and everything mixed together, as opposed to a silo. My office on campus is in a silo. It's an 18-story building. I ride up the elevator with people from mathematics, from sociology, from political science, from social work. These are some of my best friends. I have other people on campus that they live in a building, and the building is like basically a silo. They don't interact with anybody else. That's sad. Multiple degrees. We're finding that we need to be rewarding and awarding people with some creativity. All this, I think, is part of what's going to be expected of somebody earning a college university degree. Repeating the same thing I did, the same thing you did, well, maybe that's not going to work. Maybe we need to think about intersecting natural sciences and social sciences, humanities and social sciences. What's happening to many students in the United States is that they do not decide to major, specialize in a discipline. They're more interested in a program, healthcare and politics. They're interested in climatology and global warming. They're interested in looking at social welfare and looking at gender. That's where they see those intersections at work that'll help them get a job that's going to provide them flexibility, imagination for their future, rather than simply, I want you to get a chemistry degree or I want you to get an economics degree. The students are telling us that they want something that kind of intersects those different fields. And the last point here is we're going to have to look at education as a lifelong project, not simply you finish when you're 22 or 32. No, we should reward you coming back from work or staying at home and working to get some kind of an advanced training and advanced degree. Some universities are going to do this. They're the pioneers. Others are kind of laggard. Well, I don't think we should do that. Okay. Okay, the next one. Okay, restructuring subject matter. If I was teaching an introductory geography class this fall, I would really have to tell my students the very first day, I'm not sure I can teach this class. They might think, well, you must be really dumb if you can't teach this class. No, the point I would make is this fluid intellectual world is one which challenges us to think about beyond the way we've taught and the way the books are written. We have to think about this global community instead of compartments of time or compartments of space. We need to take a look at intersections, not separateness, commonalities as opposed to uniqueness. The next point, these are concepts I would use in teaching any class today, but they can be taught in an art class, they can be taught in a physics class, they can be taught in a sociology class, in an agriculture class, in an entomology class, boundaries, networks, places, landscapes, surfaces, and systems. All these intersect. We need to provide rewards for people that engage in interdisciplinary work, interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary conferences are organized. Reward them, not just reward them for the way people have been rewarded in the past. We need to think about breaking out of this silo way of looking at evaluations, promotions, tenure. Next to the last point, let's think about global issues. All disciplines can say something about these global issues: diseases, security, climate change. They see the world around them is not simply one of isolation, not simply one of silos. It's one of which there's a great deal of intersections, and we need to talk about those intersections and concepts that relate to it. And that's going to be a real challenge, I think, for many professionals and for many parents whose kids see the world maybe in a different way than they do. So the likely futures, I think, are going to be multiple employment opportunities, possibilities, building in an international relations focus for anybody. We need to have flexibility. We need to have some kind of global understanding. And for those faculty that are interested in doing this kind of restructuring of their lives and their careers, we need to reward them. If they want to break out the box and spend 6 months attending a Cartier seminars in Costa Rica, or they want to study oceans in the Mediterranean, let's reward them to do that instead of traditionally thinking about the way in which things have been done. My last point, next slide. You can read it. The present is a watershed moment in human welfare, history, and geography. I can say more about that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan, for getting us started with so many things to reflect upon this morning. And now I'd like to present Jerome Glen, who is the CEO of the Millennium Project, a global participatory think tank with 68 nodes around the world. It produces the State of the Future reports for the past 25 years. He invented the futures wheel and concepts such as conscious technology, trans institutions, telenations, management by understanding, self-actualization economy, feminine brain drain, and definitions of environmental security, collective intelligence, and scenarios. He wrote about information welfare in the late 1980s in his book, Future Mind, sent his first email in 1973, and in the mid-1980s, he was instrumental in getting X25 packet switching in 29 developing countries, which was key to low-cost access to the internet. More recently, he wrote Work Technology 2050, Scenarios and Actions, and led the American Red Cross COVID scenarios. Jerry, we're in your hands.
Thank you. Yes? Yes?
Now we can hear you.
Okay. All right. Well, one mini little correction. It was, I wrote about information warfare 30 years ago, not welfare.
Sorry.
But information welfare would be a nice idea too, actually. I have to write on that at some point. Okay. To build on what was just said, one of the things that the COVID pandemic has done and is still continuing to do is it has created a timeout for the world to rethink everything. Most of you who are parents know that when the children misbehave, sometimes you say, stop, sit down, time out, think about what you did wrong. Well, the COVID is doing that to the entire species at the same time worldwide. And after various disasters in nature, regrowth occurs. After the World War II, for example, the regrowth was multilateralism, United Nations. Possibly the regrowth after this one will be a sense that we are an interdependent planetary species, which the previous speaker was pointing out. That seems to be maybe, in my expectation, one of the things that will come out of this pandemic. that would be a good side to have happen. Okay, the Red Cross called us up and said, American Red Cross called up and said, look, we have so many issues that we have to deal with right now. Getting beds for people, getting shelters for people, getting firefighting stuff in California and flood stuff in the East Coast. We don't have time to think ahead, but we know that needs to be done. So can you do that? So we agreed to do scenarios. Normally futurists do scenarios out 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 years out. But these were just like a couple of years out, because we started writing them on the work at the very beginning of the pandemic out to the year 2022. So in a sense, they're still operative right now. And you can download the full report at this web link that you can see right there. What we did is we organized the uncertainties, because there was uncertainties about treatment. We didn't know at the time, is there going to be a vaccine? And if there is how effective will it be? You know, there was just all kinds of questions all over the place. So we organized the questions essentially into 3 categories. One, let's assume that the uncertainty turns out bad for us. And let's assume that some of the uncertainties turn out good for us. What does that look like? And let's assume the 3rd category is, let's assume it's a mix turning out for us. So that allowed us to take all of the research that was going on and throw it into these 3 categories and develop the scenarios. Each scenario describes how the pandemic may evolve from 2 years ago or a year and a half ago out to the next year. The input was made by 250 medical doctors, public health officials, emergency relief staff, economists, and futurists to provide a coherent, integrated, holistic views of what was possible coming up. Each scenario is about 10 pages of rich detail. This is not like a lot of these superficial scenarios where they describe an endpoint and say, how would you work out in that endpoint? No, we connect the endpoints, 3 alternative endpoints, with the present tense, with cause and effect links. Because as you write a story, you find all of a sudden you don't know something. You say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. I don't know what's next. And then that teaches you what you didn't know, that you didn't even know that you didn't know, but you should know in order for that future to be possible. And we've found out on contact tracing and other sorts of things what were the important unknowns to put in the scenarios for people. This became useful for planning and also for public understanding, because we get a coherent picture with a scenario. Whereas in the news, you get a piece of information there and a piece of information there and a piece of it. You know, if you think back in the beginning of the scenario, it was just a fog of all kinds of different things. And how does it make sense, hold it together? And so when the Red Cross got the scenarios, they gave a nice little quote here. These scenarios are the best integration of medical, health, socioeconomic, and psychological factors of the possible future course of COVID pandemic that we have. Now, in all fairness, they didn't have a whole lot else to look at the time. So very quickly, what we did was we put together a team of relatively well-known major futurists to take a look at what ought to be done. And then we read like crazy. This was unusual, because usually when you do a literature review, it's a narrow field. Well, you say, well, COVID was a narrow field, except its issues were economic, psychological, cultural, and it was worldwide, and it was happening simultaneously. So you had to read articles in Iran as well as in Israel. It was cutting across them. So it was so much to read. So we shared what we learned, this team, on a listserv, and then we would discuss them once a week so that we would be educating each other, so that those working in the negative scenarios knew what those working in the positive scenarios were thinking and learning, and so forth. Then we created this characteristics matrix. That's the positive, negative, and mixed way of making coherence in the research we were doing. And that, by the way, people who work on scenarios, I wish you would use a characteristics matrix. What a lot of people do is they say, well, it's bad, and here it is. With these assumptions, these 2 uncertainties, they make a little grid. but you really got to go through all of the main details on all of them. And that's what characters matrix can help with. Anyway, we did also 5 questionnaires we call a real-time Delphi. The difference between a real-time Delphi or any Delphi and a regular questionnaire is that you feedback on what other people have said. Usually when you fill out a questionnaire, you fill it out, you send it, and that's it. And then people put it all together and there's your results. We don't do that. What we do is we want each person as much as possible to react to the other people's stuff. So that when you hit the return key online, you'll see what somebody else just put in. Your name is not there, so that ideas are persuasive, not personalities and not rank, but just the ideas. So it's a way to organize a lot of complex discussions to get good inputs. So the first one we did was with health and medical officials just in the United States. And the second one was health and medical officials, but outside the United States. And then the third one we did was socioeconomic people in the United States. And the fourth one was socioeconomic people outside the United States. And then we did one on indicators, what would indicate change in the pandemic. So we wrote the draft scenarios based upon all this input. And then we shared it among each other. So we criticized the team. And then we sent it out for external reviewers to improve it, then redrafted. And that's how we ended up with the final scenarios. They were distributed worldwide October 13th. And they've been put into different languages and of course out to Red Cross, but also to NIH, Fauci staff, distributed them through NIH, National Institute of Health's listserv. And Fauci, of course, as you may know, is sort of the main leader in the United States, at least on public communications on the pandemic. And then we sent it out through conferences and talks like this and articles. 3 scenarios. The first one was America Endures. This is a mix, positive and negative. It's like you just keep on trucking on through, and there's good stuff and there's bad stuff going on. And then the depression one, the number 2 one, is that assumes essentially that there's no real change in the United States, that it was incoherence, as it was in the early days, incoherence, a lot of denials going on, and how that ripples through in the economy and becomes quite a serious mess. And then the third one is everything goes right. You have a new administration, they have a coherent thing, the vaccines work, highly effective, etc. So the 3 scenarios allows you to have your mind go through to say, what do I need to do and know in my situation relative to these possibilities? Now, when we said we did a holistic approach, we were as interested in the social well-being of the medical staff and of the public as we were about vaccinations and unemployment rates. So we wanted to have an integration of economics, medical health, and social well-being of the public, because they obviously all affect each other. And here's this characteristics matrix that I mentioned. You list down what are the key factors and what does it look like, baseline scenario or surprise-free or mixed scenario. And what does it look in the negative, what does it look in the positive, and the comments. And this is also the basics of how we did the questionnaires as well. So one of the things we do is a bit unique, is we ask, what would have to happen to go from your baseline scenario, America Endures, to the more pessimistic one? And then also, what were the factors to move it into the positive one? What was the difference? So moving to the pessimistic one was you opened too fast, which occurred. And that's why we got the second wave was much bigger than the first wave. The immunity was not reliable. Well, it turned out the immunity was pretty reliable, but it can fade later on, and the virus does mutate. And I hope that this will be available to everybody. So I don't want to go through all of these things, but you can read this. I think that the PowerPoint will be made available to the viewers. Some suggestions and impacts of the report. As I mentioned when we wrote the scenario that America Endures one, I had to show how contact tracing would or would not work. And it became very clear there was not enough people doing contact tracing in the United States to be effective. So therefore, you can't say in the scenario, contact tracing made a difference. Well, so then to make it plausible, you had to say, well, where did the new people come from? Well, they came from national military systems, and also the Peace Corps. So I happened to be on the Peace Corps' future committee. So I called up and said, hey, there's 7,000 Peace Corps volunteers that have come back from overseas because of the pandemic. What are they doing? Why don't you ask them to contact the local health officials and volunteer as contact tracers and return volunteers in the past? Why not the retired Peace Corps volunteer organization do the same? And they did. And the link there, as you'll see there on the YouTube, is Dr. Fauci thanking the Peace Corps for helping with contact tracing across the United States. That was a result of writing a scenario rather than an endpoint. By writing along the way, you think, oh, we don't know how it's going to work. What would work? Let's find out. It looks like it will work. Then we can put in the scenario, yes, these things are plausible. It was translated in Chinese and circulated in China, also in Korea. Just the executive summary was of each were done in Israel, and Spanish was also was done and circulated. It was discussed on PBS television and podcast conferences and given to our node chairs. The Millennium Project is node chairs all around the world. Concepcion is the chair of Mexico. Dr. Fauci's office, as I mentioned, circulated these scenarios for the NIH to help them think ahead. And some of the vocabulary in the G7 statement is very similar. I'm not saying we did it, but it was very similar. What we said about decentralized production. Right now, we have this idea that we're going to produce it in Germany, produce it in the UK, produce it in the United States, maybe in some in China and Russia. But why not decentralize the production in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia? I mean, it's ridiculous that Japan has such a low vaccination rate. They have perfectly good medical services and engineering. They could have been producing, you could buy a license or like a franchise, and you distribute the production capability worldwide. And we've got to do that for the next round of the next virus. And if we don't, then the situation can get a lot worse. So some implications and lessons learned for education. According to UNESCO, 1.5 billion students were affected by school closings. That's gigantic impact. It has increased the awareness that the global situation can affect every individual. So even if you are in Cape Verde, you're affected by the world situation. Doesn't matter where you are. So this globalization, global consciousness has gotten a shot in the arm, so to speak. COVID accelerated everything, not only teleeducation, but also telehealth, teleconsulting, all kinds of stuff, and artificial intelligence applications. Because when you take the reliability of the human presence out, artificial intelligence can help that be done. The mayor of Milan, Italy, had a plan for artificial intelligence to make the smart city smarter. And that was supposed to be 2030. They started implementing during the pandemic. So it has speeded up applications of artificial intelligence worldwide, including in education. We've also learned that a hybrid of in-classroom and remote learning is possible, as well as just remote learning. And more teachers that didn't take it seriously are now taking it more seriously. TV shows, movies, and music and other arts should help encourage this culture change. You'll start to see movies and television shows, coming out of the pandemic of tell this and tell that, much more than before. Exploring are being explored quickly, and new software are being undertaken to develop. So this whole idea of remote education is stimulated the software people to create new activities. And there's one example of it there that you can see. You get a hold of this yourself. Some more implications. We knew, for those involved in education on a global basis, knew that you could learn almost anything, anywhere, from any source remotely. That has been underlined more than before. So but there's an issue there of accreditation. Like if we like to say, you learn best what interests you most at the time you're interested in it, right there and access to the best experts in the world for that. That was an idealistic fantasy, but now it's a plausible thing. You can get on the internet, local thing, and do the search. Where can I get a free course on X? Or who is the best expert on this? What videos is that person available? So we know we can now do this, but then how do you get accreditation? So if you're putting, like, this is more on the university level, if you're getting areas of knowledge, but they're not all in your university, we got to work out accreditation a little bit and be a little more open-minded about that. Hence, we should make teleeducation free everywhere, ubiquitous, and as a lifelong learning systems. Integrate simulation-based learning using multiplayer environments. We know how to play computer games with players all around the world. Well, let's have educational simulations where then people can interact in teams, like the previous speaker was talking about. We have to not only learn your stuff, but also we stuff. How do we get the we stuff? Well, simulations of problems that people can work on together and learn together is I think will be one of the big things that comes out of this. Online team learning, projects, collaboration among students, because the class is in different locations, right? So they're learning how we can collaborate together on things. Online systems are beginning to use artificial intelligence for individualized learning, as well as the group learning, as I was mentioning. You can access many ideas on the future of learning and education that have been internationally assessed in a report that you can download. It's the Work Technology 2050 Scenarios and Actions. That report wasn't per se on COVID, but it was per se on how the how the whole world can change and what education's role and how it can be involved in that. Each idea was assessed by a global panel to, like, how likely it was to make a difference, how effective it was, how possible, and then comments, so that it's each page, each idea, there's, I don't know, 30 or so, something like that. Each one has a whole page of analysis. So it's not just somebody saying, do X. It says, here's how X can turn out wrong. Here's how X can turn out right. Here's how you can make it more plausible. And here are the roadblocks to it. So it's much richer. So people really involved in our learning and education, this is a treasure trove of information for you. So again, it's time for us to rethink the whole game. And hopefully activities like this will help us rethink the whole game. But the thing we can remember is we're rethinking together around the world for the first time. And this is going on in India. This is going on in South Africa. This is going on in Costa Rica, around the world. First time we thought together. Just a couple of words about the Millennium Project. It's a global system with 68 nodes around the world. A node is a group of individuals and institutions that connect local thinking and global thinking, back and forth between global and local. And the next speaker is the chair of that node in Mexico. I'm not suggesting you look at all, but this is just to say we've done a lot of different things. So we try to do a cumulative research, and each thing that we do folds into the next one so that we get smarter and smarter on each one that we do. And anybody interested in these methods, there's about 37 methods. We have 39 chapters, but because that's an introduction and conclusion, but 37 different methods. So when someone says, I look at the future, I do scenarios. Good. That's one of 37 methods. One. And you can get any of these sort of things on our website here. Thank you.
Great, Jerry. Thank you. Thank you. That was a mastery of summarizing, I think. Our next panelist is Concepcion Olavarrieta, who is president, as Jerry said, of the Mexican node of the Millennium Project, also vice chair of the board of directors of the Millennium Project, and secretary general of the Ibero-American Network. She is specialized in foresight studies and is the founder of the Mexican Social Land Engage, co-creator of the Global Millennium Prize with coverage in 110 countries, compiler and coordinator of Futures, the first World Foresight Encyclopedic Dictionary, co-author of The Future of Transnational Organized Crime in Mexico by 2050, which focuses on the prevention ecosystem, and co-coordinator of the just published Futures Mexico by 2050. Take us to Mexico, Concepcion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan. So good morning to everyone. This is a new book that we have just published. And it's the version that we have now. It's a printed version and a digital version in Spanish. The name is Futuro México hacia 2050. But in 2 months, we will have the English version published by the Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey. So I welcome what I'm presenting to you. It's something that you will find it in both versions. But the purpose of this book is to have 3 goals, to reach 3 goals. One is the better design and implementation of public, private, and social policies for positive alternative futures. The second one is to promote awareness and culture of society and how to eliminate or mitigate threats and enhance the holistic opportunities they may face. And the third one is to foster guidance projects that are triggers and help to recognize the importance of creating better options. The book has an introduction and 3 chapters. The first one are the 15 challenges by 2050. The second was 3 scenarios, and the fourth one is 45 guiding projects. In the introduction, we mentioned the strong disruptions that we are living at the present and the risk of post-normal times and liquid modernity. So just to remember you what Xiaodin Sardar and John Sweeney have written in regard to the definition for post-normal times, mentioned you that they consider it as an intermediate period in which the old orthodoxies are dying, the new ones are yet to be born, and very few things seem to make sense. Yeah, another description would be a description of nature that rapidly changes our world, a call to see the world for what it has been and to imagine how it can be different. And for liquid modernity, Zygmunt Bauman wrote, "Our society lives in a fluid and volatile state without values that are too strong. Constant and transitory change tied to educational, cultural, and economic factors. Uncertainty prevails due to the dizzying speed of change." In the introduction, we analyze the Millennium Project 15 global challenges, which are sustainable development, clean water, population and resources, democratization, global foresight and decision-making, global convergence of information technology, rich and poor gap, health issues, education and learning, peace and conflict, status of women, transnational organized crime, energy, science and technology, global ethics. All of them have the same importance. And we also compare them with the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals. You can see here the authors that have written the 15 essays in regard to each of these challenges. So the way we organize the book is that each author had to write a diagnosis, very strong, very robust, and propose their visions and reflections. And because the 15 challenges impact amongst them, then we left for a different chapters the scenario chapters analysis. So Margarita Arroyo was the author of Challenge 9, that's education, and she named it Foresight of Mexican Education by 2050, Resilience and for Liquid Times. Once again, Zygmunt Bauman mentions that these are flexible, fickle times in which social structures no longer last long enough to solidify and do not serve as frame of reference for actions. So the content of these essays refers more about liquid times in Mexico that we are living, The signs of the future, these are the chapters that she has on it. Signs of the future, there are future and approach to alternative scenarios, and final thoughts. In Signs of the Future, she mentions the debate on the future of education, Mexico, slow progress, past burdens, and liquid future, from reform to reconversion and neoliberal model. There are future, an approach to alternative scenarios, trans-Balkanization of education, the desirable possible, resilience as a transition to postmodernity, and future. And at the end, she finished her ACEs with some predictions and proposals. So we have these three scenarios, as I mentioned. The first one was named National Plenitude, Mexico Democratic, Just, and in Peace. The second one, Futures Mexico, the Eternal Promise. The third one, Agony and Desolation, Mexico Mutilated and Punished and Atrocious. Because what I mentioned is that the 15 challenges and the 15 global challenges and the 15 Mexican challenges have a holistic impact. So to write these scenarios, we first found out which were the key factors. We found that there were 45 with 135 topics. So we crossed them. For today, I'm just showing you part of the way we work on it, the methodology that we use for Challenge 9, which is educational learning, that we found out that there were 3 factors with 9 key topics. So education system and education reform, information, communication technologies, resilience, and change of era. These are the 3 factors. On education system and the national plenitude scenario, Mexico Democratic, Just, and in Peace, we found out that educational distribution increases, school infrastructure evolves to learning communities, study plans are flexible, updated, and relevant at all levels. In information, communication, and technology, ICTs are generating innovative and resilient processes, creating new paradigm, inclusive, supportive, and cooperative. Mexico is incorporated in the knowledge society. In resilience and change of era, collaborative, fraternal, and supportive education builds a free and prosperous society. Full use of technology in education eradicate exploitation and marginalization. In the second scenario, Futures Mexico, the Eternal Promise in education system, educational reform is attention to the 100% in basic education, full renovation of teaching, schools are sufficient infrastructure, equipped with updated technologies according to pedagogical models and situated learning. Educational plans are flexible, adapt, expand, and facilitate access. In information, communication, and technology, new technologies are incorporated. Schools have effectively coped with the disruptive forces to accelerate the process of reconversion. With difficulties, Mexico is incorporated into the knowledge society. In resilience and change of area, educational lags are addressed, illiteracy, coverage, equity, inclusion, interculturality, and quality. Society has other spaces and means to learn and know, new information, new technologies. And in the third scenario, agony and desolation, Mexico mutilated and punished and atrocious. Education system, educational reform is fragmented. Educational system becomes a private good and loses its value as a public good. The evils of the system continue. Clientelism, corporativism, conservatism, inefficient and ineffective management. Renovating of teaching staff has not been possible. Infrastructure has deteriorated and not have enough technologies. In information, communication, and technology, we found that new technologies are not incorporated in schools in a proper way. Innovative and resilient processes have failed. In resilience and change of era, the country disintegrates. It cannot overcome its ancestral lags of marginalization and poverty. attempts to create an egalitarian society have failed to reduce social gaps. And which were, this is the last chapter, the priority criteria for 5 guiding projects on education. The first one, invest in infrastructure and school equipment to guarantee minimum conditions for learning, especially in areas of marginalization and poverty. The second one, reconverting the school model. The second, generate national information technology strategy. The first one, developing collaborative, virtual, and interactive models, as well as open, flexible, and individualized curricula. In the second one, to generate innovative processes in the educational field. The third one, prepare the program for updating and training teachers and educational agents in the skills for the 21st century. The fourth one, integrate an evaluation system for both teachers and students, inclusive, efficient, and linking standardized evaluations with formative evaluation at all levels. And the fifth one is to implement a certification system of competencies and strong and skills for lifelong learning. With this idea for guiding projects, we consider that they should be measurable, integrative, transformative, productive, with long-term investment, permanently traceable before developing the Future's Mexico strategic plan. So I invite you all to read Futuros México hacia 2050, and in 2 months, these are the links that you can have access in the digital version, or you can ask also for the printed version. And in 2 months, Mexico 2050 challenges, scenarios, and action will be ready for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Concepcion. Very complete and a good example for other countries to use. Wouldn't it be wonderful if every country in the world produced a book like this for local and national leaders and international advisors, so that we all have a clearer picture of where we're going and where each country thinks it should be going, and what the scenarios are as different options and what to avoid. So now we're going to open this up for dialogue. And I would just ask our panelists, given what we have listened to this morning, considering all 3 presentations, which I think complement one another very well, what are some conclusions? What are some pieces of insight for future thinkers? What comes out of this picture that we have painted this morning? It's a difficult one, especially when we put it together with the recent report of the IPCC. I think that education is the topic that we've been discussing, but climate change is certainly an important part of these multiple crises that we're living with. So I open it up. Jerry, give us there you go. And if the Director General would like to join us, that would be great. And open for discussion, open for reflection.
One of the things I would see coming out of this is that in the past, to a large degree, there was a sense that there was one future. We're moving into that, whatever it is, and that we look at the future to predict it, to say what will be this, what will be that. And in the past, you would go to somebody with a crystal ball, or you'd go to the witch doctor with some bone or something, but it wasn't an idea that we were inventing the future. We accept that you can invent the technology. We accept that you can invent all kinds of stuff, but we now are in a situation where not only can we invent the future, we're going to have to, because the current direction of water, of climate change, you name it, is not necessarily great. So we'll have to invent the future rather than just inherit those dynamics. And so we don't have to be like the insect on a log floating down the river. Instead, we can sort of grab a leaf, get a little paddle, and create an alternative for that little insect floating down the river. So I think the first speaker was clear about that. We got to change. I was too, something like that. And then Conception gave an example in the country. So I think that one of the things that we can reinforce out of here is you don't have to inherit the future, you can invent it.
Right, and while we're inventing it, which is sort of an external process, we also have to be doing some internal work because we have to develop that resilience to navigate these multiple crises and to become different kinds of human beings with different lifestyles so that we survive.
Yeah, because you can't shift from inherit to invent unless there's an internal fundamental difference in your view of reality and yourself as an agent of reality.
Jerry, I would like you to mention how have the Millennium Project developed the 15 global challenges, because I think that's a framework that is very useful for educating people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we began essentially with a blank piece of paper and we sent out to futurists around the world and said, okay, what's going on right now that's going to become a very big deal in 25 years that people either don't know much about or are misunderstanding what it could be? And give me a reference. So it wasn't just a bottle of tequila and somebody writing. You had to have some references. And then give me your estimate of what it might be in 10 years and what it might be in 25 years. We collected about, and there's a lot of overlaps, of course, but we collected about, I don't know, over 100 developments. We went through a long process of interviewing people who should do this and questionnaires and so forth. And it's distilled down to 15 issues at first. And the planning committee of some of the nodes and so forth said, you acted like a bunch of engineers. You're looking at problems. What about the opportunity side? You got to get it equal time. So then we did the same process all over again, but on opportunities. And then the third year, we put them together into the challenges, and that's how the challenges got created. And I think it was the people in Finland that said, stop changing. We like this framework to evaluate ourselves through time. So we've kept essentially all 15 since then. We opened up education just a few years ago because we didn't have it before, because education was a strategy in every challenge, in every issue, in everything. You know, it's important everywhere. So just repeating it all over the place seemed to be sort of silly. But because of the advances in the last 5 years of cognitive science, brain research, and national projects of brain research in China, United States, Japan, European Union, and because of the advances in artificial intelligence and major Cold War competition on that worldwide, these two things together was so big that we couldn't just ignore it. So we put two other challenges together into one about decision making, and then ripped out education as a separate, and learning, I would say. Remember, education is what they do to you, and learning is what you do. So that's why that change happened, and it is extraordinary. People are unaware of how much the brain can be improved, not only biologically but also augmentation, both. You know, and it's conceivable in 10, well, maybe not 10, 10 to 20 years, we're going to have augmented geniuses. I mean, one of the ways we define a genius is, can you take a test and get a score, certain score? Okay. Well, if you have charged coupled devices or contact lenses or whatever with internet connections and so forth, and it's recognition, then immediately you got the right answer for every single question. So behaviorally, you have scored genius.
And we had a great experience, John, as well, with the Global Millennium Prize. You remember that we had in Mexico? We started with a pilot project, and after that, Jerry came here to the award ceremony, and he said, I wish this Millennium Award would become a global one. And that's the way we started it by internet. And the response was absolutely great. We had, along 5 years that we had this award in Mexico, this prize in Mexico, we had the participation of 110 countries with more than 7 million hits. So it's a very good way to start in educating children about the responsibility of the dreams that they would like to reach for one of the challenges. So I would advise those countries that are not involved really to start with this kind of prize. It is very useful. Please. Mm-hmm.
And there's a side benefit that we didn't think about at first, but it was so beautiful, because when that first award ceremony happened, you would have parents coming in with their child from a poor area of Mexico, had never been in Mexico City before, standing next to some very sharp, tall guy with cufflinks and good shirt, and they came in with, they're very wealthy, and they're right next to each other. And that was beautiful to see.
And like later on, we had it international ceremonies as well, with winners from all over the world. So it's a very good to start teaching responsibility about the future. When they build it, they really get empowered. And after that, now I'm very pleased to say that Brazil has that knew about the books Futuros Mexico by 2050. They say, I would like to use it as a teacher for training my students on the challenges. So I will invite them for Brazil to prepare this book, and I'm speaking at the master's level, master's degree that they are studying now, and I think that's a very good start as well. It's becoming a replicable model, and that's pretty much the idea of the book. So for all teachers that are now, it will be very useful for you to read it as well.
Jerry mentioned something about the brain. And I really think that all teachers at all levels need to have a basic course in neuroscience, so that we start from that basis and help people learn how to dialogue with their brain, with their mind, with their inner self, so that they are more masters of their own fate. Somehow we talk about empowerment, but we don't really have it very clear how this can be institutionalized into the system so that people can grow themselves. Yeah. Stan.
Just a few thoughts. I think the three of us underlined that the point that COVID is more than a health issue. That in itself is an important point. If that's the case, we agree on that, then that means almost any discipline has something to say about this problem. It's not just biologists, it's not just sociologists or people in the medical fields. Second is that I think we have to consider, beneath all of this possible reform, we have to consider politics. Everything is politics. That's what I teach my students. Everything is politics. What you learn, how you behave, how you act, what you can, what you cannot do. There's a political structure framework that's part of everybody. And to get any reform, any change, we have to consider what's going on with respect to governmental and non-government organizations. Third, I think in many ways, we're talking about a luxury subject. most people do not think the way we think. They do not act the way we do. We're all transdisciplinarians, interdisciplinarians, and international. I can think even of my own colleagues far and wide around the world. Most people do not think the way we're talking. They just do not. To think the way we're thinking is outside their comfort zone. So I think somewhere, some way, we need to think about reaching other people that might be interested in what we're doing. If you think about the diffusion curve, which is both time and space, you have the early adopters. They're the majority. Then you also have at the end, you have the laggards.
Man.
I would like to see this 2-hour session translated into 10 different languages and make it available to people in universities, think tanks around the world. Whatever they say about what we're doing, that's up to them. But the point is, we're trying to get people to think outside the box and make this more than simply just a luxury group of futurists who have good ideas and are creative and transdisciplinarians. Those are just some thought. Final point, and this sort of, I don't think anybody really made this point, but it's kind of subterranean, is COVID is really not only a political problem, it's also a media issue. This is the first time in human history where we've had a health issue globally in which we've seen discussions about it daily on maps and photographs and graphs, as opposed to just text. And I think that's an important point to make, is that we need to think, how do you read a map? If geography did not exist before this pandemic, it would be coming into full, because you have to have some kind of a spatial temporal dimension. And I think that also the media is reporting words and images about people around the world on these issues. So if one looked at a television station in Nairobi and one in Cape Town and one in Perth and one in Calcutta and one in Asuncion and one in Mexico City, take a look at wherever you're, what is shown on evening news about COVID. And I would expect that some are international and some are very ultranational. But I think that's an important part of this learning as a global problem. It's not simply just a problem of the 10 countries that have the most cases or have the most deaths. How is it being looked at by the media? And the media, in many ways, I think we've all said, is that all these professions are just a bunch of learners. They're just learning and we're groping, and we just have to admit that. And I think that would come across, if anybody, this is translated into Arabic or Chinese or something else, they would see that we're just kind of trying to make some sense of this. That's my 2 cents.
Jerry, maybe you would like to mention something in regard to this, that it was in 1998 when you mentioned the pandemia, and the many pandemias that were coming.
Right.
State of the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there was. We were asked, did you guys warn us about global pandemic? So I had to go back through the early State of the Future reports, and I was amazed to find one of the sentences. And yes, we did. We talked about that. As a matter of fact, Challenge 8 is essentially about that. It's one of the 15 global challenges. But in the early explanation of that, I think one of the first or second State of the Future reports, we had something like because of the the travel, et cetera, population, et cetera, and moving into animal areas and all that, that sooner or later, civilization as we know it will come to a grinding halt. I'm amazed that I've used that phrase, grinding halt. That was very pushy for that time. But we did. The world came to a grinding halt for a while. They closed the airports, they closed the travel, stay at home. We came to a grinding halt. So yeah, we did. We didn't predict what year. We just said, yes, that's inevitable.
But you said it 23 years ago because you sent me an article. Yeah.
Mhm.
I would like to go back to, I think Stan said something just now about comfort zone, people coming out of their comfort zone. And Soledad, Concepcion, you mentioned in your presentation about Zygmunt Bauman and liquid modernity and liquid space and liquid love. And so what can we learn from Dr. Bauman that will help us to encourage people not to be afraid to come out of their comfort zone? Because the fear that drives people at times of crisis like those we have today, it has to do with that. It has to do with things like facing death and mortality and learning how to live outside of our comfort. What do you think, Concepcion? What do you think? You've done so much reading of his work.
I think that there's to have a hope and to have a dream. It is very important that you will be able to reach it. And that's the way to start with, like in a project in your life, and be responsible for it. I think that whatever you want to study doesn't matter. It's your time, it's your decision. And but just be responsible on what you are doing and how can you help others to go closer to your illusions and involve them. I think that's the way that we teach our children, and then we go along their own lives, respecting them and trying to help them. But at the same time, if they discover a new path, we have to admire that. And I think that is very, very important, that if we open as parents our way of thinking, this is the only way that people will feel very, very strong and fight for it. So that would be my
Right.
suggestion.
Sort of like Viktor Frankl and the logotherapy approach to life, to be sure we have a purpose, and that purpose becomes an anchor that sustains us as we travel uncertainty.
And Jerry mentioned also this study that the Millennium Project finished on the work technology 2050 scenarios, and he might bring some out of the things that he found about try to find yourself, and once you know what you want to do, then fight for it. But you are not expecting to be hired by someone else. Just try to be your own boss. No, maybe Jerry, would you like to mention something like that?
Well, yeah. It was not really possible, or not particularly easy, for anybody to make a living out of being themselves in the past. You know, you were a fisherman, or you were a farmer, or you were a witch doctor, but that was about it. You didn't have, and secondly, you were in a local area. There was no thought that you could be, in a sense, employed by somebody halfway around the world. Now, we still have an education system that is teaching people to fit in. This is how you fit in. You have to pass this test, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You have to get a job from a person there. And increasingly, people are realizing that they can find markets for themselves worldwide. So you're looking for markets worldwide rather than a local job. Because there may not be that local job there, because the jobs are changing because of all the rest of the stuff we can talk about. But what doesn't change is you. I mean, you're talking about anchoring, you know, the self, your purpose, right? That's very cool. It says, okay, how can I make a living out of being me? Like, for example, I am in the self-actualizing economy myself. I like talking about the future and turning people on to thinking about it. That's how I make a living. And how do I make a living? From markets around the whole world. So, and it seems to me, when you find out that some people like to make these quilts, as a famous example in the early internet, there's a woman just loves to make quilts of different designs. And all of a sudden, she got orders from around the world with all kinds of different requests. And she's doing fabulous. But she's making a living out of doing what she's liked it. And she's freed up. So she doesn't worry about when she works and when she doesn't work. That's her decision. And she doesn't have to worry about a boss that doesn't like her
Yeah.
and not paying her right, etc. So that is a beginning of a trend. I mean, it's not big time worldwide yet, but as automation goes from artificial narrow intelligence we have today to eventually artificial general intelligence we don't have yet, the economic impact on that is going to be gigantic.
Mm-hmm.
The difference is like saying the internet and the fax machine. Yeah, they're both part of the information economy, but they're really different in their impact. And that's the difference between narrow intelligence and general. So the economic impact, employment impact will change when that stuff comes in a big way. So we should begin to get people to understand how to use the internet to find people, which we're beginning to do anyway, slowly. But right now you have affinity groups and different groups, but then slowly imagine how much of the world has to be interested in what you're interested in. Very, 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 very small part. But that's plenty enough to make a living.
We have an interesting question from Marco Moreno, who's at the Autonomous University of Tamaulipas in Mexico. And he's asking, how does this type of research or project impact or motivate decision makers or the general population to participate or act? And that we really haven't talked about that, how to mobilize the public sector.
Well, the idea in the case of the book was pretty much, as you know, Marco, that one. So we can give this book to the policy, to the policy designers and to the decision makers to read. And that was the main purpose of the guiding projects. Also, how can they start building something, changing or adjusting it? So that would be my
Are you planning to do any?
Well, we have many launchings. We have amongst our group of authors, there is one who is a politician, and he's involved of this link with the politics, with the politic people, and he was also the president of the Institute of Management Public, I think. Public Management Studies in the state of Mexico. So he's taking care of that. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
He has been a senator, he has been a deputy, he has been a president of a municipality. So he has a lot of experience. Besides that, he has been the ambassador in different countries. So we're like a team. And that's a way.
Thinking of something that I saw in this wonderful short film called The Good Future by Gerd, where he talks about the fact that public leaders should have a license to guide us into the future. And I'm wondering whether your book on 2050, what if in every country they had to produce one of these books, and it is the basis for getting the license, and you can't be elected, and thinking of this idea that came up. Yeah,
we need at least 2 generations to reach the dreams that we need in general. So that's the reason why we are giving them the ideas here to start doing something. Most of the politicians, when they make, in the case of Mexico, when they are not in office, what they do is that they open their own consulting firms as well. But they keep also involved in politics, not very active, but they are in the back. I can say that. Mm-hmm. So we're doing on our part, Penguin Random House, and has been the publisher. So, and he's very responsible, and he's doing many launchings. We have maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 launches per week.
Good, good.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a message from Ricardo Russo. Ricardo is has an academic who has run many programs in environmental management, and has just recently become our ethical environment advisor at our foundation. So Ricardo says, first, congratulations to the three panelists. Second, Jerry's concept of reality makes me remember what sometime I read, that the modern science is founded on the idea of a total separation between the observing subject and the reality, assumed to be completely independent from the first one. But the idea of transdisciplinarity and different levels of reality open new horizons. I would like to know your opinion, Jerome. Thank you.
Oh my, the truth of the universe sort of questions. Oh man, just because I got this in the background doesn't mean I understand. Oh my, well, it's a obviously profound point. And I think we may be the generation or period, not one period, of a transition of the flow between individual and external and trans, not like disciplinary, but transhuman, so to speak, transpersonal psychology, all of these sort of things. To me, maybe we're catching up to the Hindus. I don't know, and the Buddhists. You got a Buddha hanging up behind you there. We may be catching up to them on this stuff. But in the Western culture, we were very much exactly as you're saying. Here, objective reality out there. And with advances in theories on, subatomic stuff and all this quantum technologies coming up and quantum computing, the idea of affecting, well, let me have some little fun here, because you ask a heavy question, so I get to have a little fun with it. Okay. There's a thing called quantum entanglement. It basically, oversimplifying, is you take a couple of protons and or photons, photon, and you separate them, and somehow they're connected. I say somehow because we're not sure how that works. This is what Einstein called spooky at a distance. So if you move a photon, rotate a certain way, the other one simultaneously rotates the other way. Now, that quantum entanglement. And China said 2 years ago that they launched a satellite that was quantum entangled with the Earth receiving station and satellite up there. Do a Google search, quantum entanglement, China satellite, and you'll be amazed. That's a couple of years ago. Now, and we're also in nature too. So could we also be quantum entangled? And if you have two people have an encounter of some sort, and then they go off around the world, are there still some quantum psychic entanglement? I don't know, but it's a nice idea to play with.
Interesting. Arnaldo says he already developed a global consciousness indicator that may help to foster development according to the level of consciousness as mentioned on the classical model of the spiral dynamics. I think that's a statement. I don't see a question there. Anybody would like to make a comment about that?
I always worry about levels of consciousness. Yeah. I know this is treading on dangerous territory with Buddha hanging behind you there, but I'm not sure Buddha had talked about levels either. But anyway, because levels doesn't have to, but tends to be a source of prejudice. Mm-hmm. The lower level is inferior to a higher level. Mm-hmm. Well, if you have an interdependent universe, that doesn't make any sense. It's like someone says, well, on the provincial level versus the national level. Oh, so the provincial level is inferior? No, it's different.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think one of the most poignant lessons that we've all had to learn is that the indigenous wisdom with regard to Mother Nature and living in harmony with our environment, which is something that we have ignored for so many years, is now so important to our survival.
Right. Yeah, one thing I learned as a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa was that everybody's brain is working basically the same speed. just processing different information.
Mhm.
They don't know much about, spaceships and so forth. But if you're processing all this technological civilization, you might not be processing all the biological, natural civilization, so to speak. Whereas the people in the village, they got much more of that processing going on than the other stuff going on. So yeah, we get, it stands to reason we should have a conversation.
I think
think-
also if you're, oh, go ahead, Stan. We haven't heard from you. Please, go ahead.
I think one of the interesting phases of the present is, at least it comes across in US news, and I can't comment about other countries, is that there are deliberate efforts to ensure that science and the arts are both discussed with respect to COVID.
Uh,
It's not just a medical, biological health problem. And we find reports about artists, musicians, architects, novelists, poets. And in the book I'm editing, I made a deliberate effort to include people from the arts and humanities, because in my thinking, they have just as much to say about COVID as the people who work in biological sciences, on epidemiology. I think it's difficult, I think as Jerry said, I think it's difficult for the sciences to admit that there's quality work coming out of the arts, because they're not wired that way, unfortunately. I think it's just as much difficult for the art community to think about the science community. So I think we need to think about ways in which we can get these groups, at least some people, talking about feelings, about touching, about love, about sentiments. And these are both human endeavors as well as scientific. And I think that's something which we need to focus on. Going back to the question that was asked earlier, is that if there is an interdisciplinary group that was going to be looking at these issues, I would agree that we'd want to have more people than just the medical sciences, more people than just the politicians. Remember, most politicians are in business to get reelected. They're not concerned about necessary societal futures or environmental futures. But I think about even the daily reports in America have discussions about environmental issues and COVID issues, and they do overlap. They do overlap, and we need to think about what can be done about listening to the people who are involved in both and the people who are trained in both. And as a point I made earlier in my presentation, I think we need to think about the futures being much more than simply technology. There's no discussion so far today about poverty, about gender issues specifically, about children, about refugees, about people who are just experiencing a lot of distress in their life. That's part of the life of people who live with COVID every day. So it's much more than simply just finding a vaccine or number of people who have been vaccinated during a given day. We need to think about the human and the humane part of this pandemic. And I'm not sure that, going back, politicians, I talk about America, I'm not sure many politicians have any sensitivity at all with respect to the people who are being discriminated against, women, violence, losing jobs, having to take care of children and the elderly. So there's a whole world of human welfare, which is stepping back, not stepping ahead at this time. And I think we need to take a look at those people who are being left behind, not being discussed, and being marginalized. These could be street people, these could be CEOs who have been left a job, whatever they may be, they're part of this human face of COVID.
Well said. Well said. That all connects with one of the topics that is very close to my heart, which is ending our existential poverty, which is our poverty of soul, our poverty with regard to those who are excluded. And you described that very well. And I'm not so sure in the mega volume that you've been working on, Stan, are there some authors looking at exclusion? What's happening with
I have,
groups like
there are about 150 authors in the book. And there's a whole section dealing with health issues, but there's also chapters dealing with faith communities. And some people in faith communities, just, I think I made the point earlier, I think others have mentioned as well, all the institutions are just accepting something the way it was taught, the way it is. So they're kind of relooking, and as I said, the issues facing racism, sexism, hierarchy, social hierarchy, those are basically the same in Central America as they are in India, and they are in Middle East, and they are in Europe. There's not that much difference. The important point I made in this book is I wanted to make sure that there were different voices from different parts of the world talking about whatever they wanted to talk about with respect to COVID. And that's, to me, that's one of the major advantages of the book. Because it really shows that we really are in this boat together. There's not a separate boat for Europe. There's not a separate boat for the politicians. They're all over.
When can we expect to see the books, Dan?
Well, the 150 chapters are going to the publisher today, Springer. It's my 6th book with Springer. It'll probably be out in 6 months. The book will be dated as soon as it comes out, but it'll be a timepiece which has people from 70 different countries, from many different disciplines. And one other point I should make is that the authors are coming from many different disciplines in many different countries, but they're writing about an issue which they were not trained in. So they're not biologists and medical professionals. There are people maybe trained in political science or sociology or architecture or in music, but they see the sensitivity of trying to look at this issue in a global context. And that's a plus. That's a big plus.
And what are you planning to do in the next 6 months so we can learn more about what is?
Well, at the end, if they want, I can send you the first chapter, which I wrote, titled as Introduction. There's no end to the future. Okay, there's no end to the future, and I list about 100 topics that can be studied. But there's, as I said, I think in many cases, and I make this point, in many cases, I think that, and probably the rest of Concepcion and Jerome would agree on this, we have sort of lived a luxury life of intelligence. We've not really looked sufficiently at ground truth and people who are affected by it. There's a certain security in doing something that you're going to get rewarded for. And the rewards in the past have been doing what I've told you to do and doing what I did. I think this whole COVID issue is going to break down institutional barriers, finally. And that's going to mean people will say, I would like to work with biologists. I'm an anthropologist. I'd like to work with biologists for 6 months doing field work on COVID somewhere in Tanzania. Okay. I'm interested in art. I'm interested in looking at art expressions. I studied Renaissance art in Italy, but I'd like to look at Renaissance art with respect to COVID in Burkina Faso or in Democratic Republic of Congo, and give that permission to do that and publish outside the hallowed journals and adopt a different kind of a promotion strategy than everybody else has had. So in many ways, I think the universities, we're talking about universities are really solid rock, Gibraltar kinds of institutions. To get any kind of reform, it takes more than an act of God. But this might be the time, as Jerry can say, it might be the time for interdisciplinary teams to make recommendations.
Good. Well, on that note, I don't know if thank you, Stan. That leaves us some interesting material to ponder. Would we like to hear any more closing remarks before we sign off here? It's been very, very interesting.
Oh, I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but one little warning, folks, we had in the scenarios, is that it takes a longer time for the virus to go through Africa, which means its spread will take a longer time. And I worked in hospitals in Africa. They're not in great shape. to handle it, which
Mhm.
means the death rate will be a lot higher.
Mm.
It also means that the mutations coming out of Africa will take a longer time to get mutated and to come to the north.
Mm.
So we've had some stuff from India and Brazil and South Africa. We haven't seen anything. Well, not South. Well, South Africa is an unusual part of Africa, but all the rest of Africa, you haven't heard much coming out of that yet. But it's growing on right now,
Mm.
and so we're going to have to get ready to double check all the DNA coming out of South Africa and getting ready for new kinds of vaccines, possibly or boosters. But that's something we got to keep our eye on.
Thank you for that realistic news, Jerry. We need to tune in to being able to handle realistic news, I think.
And take
Concepcion,
advantage of the planetary conversation because we're getting it together more than before.
that's right. I mean, look at what we're doing.
Yes.
Concepcion, give us your
invite
words.
I invite you all to read our book, Mexico 2050. It's an effort that we got from everybody, good feelings, good feedback, and it has taken us almost 5 years to write and coming out with the book. That's because we are futurists. We consider all the possibilities that things like the pandemic could appear. So it is a good way to start learning a new approach for the future.
Well, thanks to all three of our wonderful panelists and to Katya and Fidel and all of our key team who helped us to put this together. We didn't have as many participants as we would have liked, but this goes up on YouTube within the next 24 hours. It will be on the Katya channel. And we know that a lot of people who are busy working today will be able to see it, and we will use it. We will use this beautiful dialogue amongst us for many purposes, and maybe even see what we can do to implement Stan's idea, turning it into a multiple language product. The next webinar in our series of Rethinking the Future, Education with Vision, is on September 10th, and it will focus on higher education. We don't know at this point whether it's going to be in English or in Spanish because all three of our panelists speak both languages, so we're still trying to determine that. But we're leaning towards Spanish because we think that, and Concepcion can validate this, we need a lot of future thinking in Latin America, and that's one way we can do it. So many, many thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations for the great effort.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being part of the successful activity. And thanks to Kenneth, particularly, who is our technician, and he always is 5-star. So thank you to everybody. See you next time.
Okay.